This is a special edition of Panorama. In the short space of 45 minutes, we're trying to show some of the significant trends, some of the problems which the world will face in the 1960s. The whole world, not just Britain. And we can start with a significant and perhaps a rather ominous fact. By 1970, the population of the world will be 600 million people greater than it is today. And more than 2/3 of the total population will then be colored. Now take Africa. Africa, which today has a population of 233 million. In 1970, it'll have a population of 284 million. This could be the first great challenge of the 60s. Robin Day reports.
These are the people and millions like them who will command world attention in the next 10 years. The people of Africa. More and more of them will be allowed to govern themselves. Colonial rule and white supremacy are on the way out. Africa enters a decade of tension and upheaval. The Africans you see here are lucky, for they live in a place where the racial and political outlook is calm and confident. For this is Dar es Salaam, capital of Tanganyika, the coffee and diamonds territory on the sweltering east coast of Africa. And later this year, in 1960, the 9 million people of Tanganyika, now administered by the British, will take their first big step forward to self-government. And the encouraging thing is that their African leader has been able to win this swift advance without violence of any sort and without ever having been to prison. He's a young ex-schoolmaster, his name Julius Nyerere, and he'll be, within the next 10 years, Tanganyika's first prime minister, and more than that, the first black leader of a multiracial African state. Mr. Nyerere, is this going to be a happy new year for Tanganyika, do you think?
I'm certain it's going to be a very happy new year.
For you, as an African nationalist leader, what do you see as the challenge of the 60s?
Well, I think, obviously, one, Africa is committed to the achievement of complete independence from colonial rule. And I think this next decade should be the decade in which we should really get the whole of Africa free.
And what is the biggest problem for the new African states?
I think there are going to be two main problems. One is the usual one of establishing stable states, and the other one, of course, is one of economic development.
I'd like to ask you about that. In territories which have so long been dependent on white skill and administration and capital, are you sure that you can run your own affairs?
I'm certain myself.
Do you want white people to stay and make their home in your territory?
Certainly, certainly. I think people make a mistake. There is this confusion. I think the confusion is largely in East and Central Africa, that when we demand our independence, and because we demand it from the white man who is governing Africa, they confuse this with a desire to get rid of the white men from the African continent. It's not true.
And how can you combine African self-government with real lasting safeguards for white minorities and Asian minorities?
We happen to have white minorities and Asian minorities in Africa, but there are minorities in other countries of the world, and the safeguard for a minority is really the ordinary democratic safeguard of a person being accepted as an individual citizen of a country. And I don't see why in independent Africa, a European, an Asian, an Arab, or a member of any other minority community should not, as an individual, be accepted as a citizen of the country. And that, to me, is really the greatest safeguard.
But some of the white settlers, particularly in Kenya, seem nervous about this.
I know they're nervous. I know they're nervous for two things. One, I think, is the one I have said, where they think the demand for independence is equivalent to a desire to get rid of the white man from Kenya, which is not true. The other one, I may be forgiven to say this, the other one, I think, is a guilt conscience, that the African might retaliate.
How can African independence, such as you are going to achieve, probably within the next 10 years, be prevented from becoming a dictatorship by the majority? How could you make democracy really work, in other words?
Democracy can only work when a people want to work it. I can't say myself, quite frankly, that there is a formula, there is some magic which once applied, democracy is going to work. Democracy works, is made to work by the people. And let me say, I have noticed nothing in Africa which has reduced my faith that democracy will work in Africa.
What impact do you think that your own speedy advance towards self-government here in Tanganyika is going to have on neighboring territories such as Kenya, Uganda, and maybe Central Africa?
Well, I think certainly two. One, Kenya and the other countries which have not yet been promised the sort of changes which are going to take place in Tanganyika are certainly going to demand the same changes. They're certainly going to ask why they cannot get the same changes as are promised in Tanganyika. Yes, I hope also that the European, particularly in Kenya and Central Africa, will look at Tanganyika and say, is democracy after all such a danger? And I think the answer he will get from Tanganyika is it's not.
Do you want to see the new states of Africa join together?
I think the tendency in Africa will be for these new states to join together in bigger units. I don't doubt that. And I think it's likely to be the same tendency in East Africa.
And you would like to see that in East Africa?
I would like myself to see countries like Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, which have the same kind of tradition, the same kind of governmental unit, eventually joining in a federation.
How soon?
I don't know. It depends upon the people. It's got to wait until the countries themselves are free.
And Tanganyika is the biggest of those countries, most populous. You as leader, possibly?
No. The important thing definitely is to build up units which are much bigger, much more viable, with a greater influence in not only in Africa, but in the world.
And now, China. China today was 640 million people. In 1970, 795 million. And if you include Japan and Korea, the population of East Asia by 1970 will be nearly 1,000 million. And next door to China, and very conscious of it at this moment, the subcontinent of India. India, with today 530 millions, in 1970, 617 million. As well as the threat from those 800 million Chinese, the challenge that faces India today is how to nourish her own enormous population and how to maintain her position as a big neutral power between East and West. James Mossman in New Delhi asks Pandit Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, whether the Cold War will continue to the 60s.
I should think not. It would be a very bad thing if it lasted. Already there are some signs of its getting less. When it will entirely cease is difficult to say, but I think progressively it will get less and less.
What major concessions do you think that either, say, America or Russia could make in the next 10 years, or would be likely to make, that would end it?
Major concessions have to be considered in the light of any particular problem. For instance, now they are dealing with European problems, Germany, etc. I don't know, and I really can't say what concessions. The real thing is, if they could get rid of the fear that the other will attack them. Once they get rid of that fear, the rest becomes relatively easy.
Do you think the Russian communist system will become increasingly a search for a welfare state and abandon world revolution?
I think that has already happened. I do not think that Russia has any desire for territorial expansion. It's what I would call a satisfied power territorially. Naturally, it has a desire to impress the world with its own achievements. But that is a good thing in a sense, because it leads to internal evolution and not anything that frightens others.
What about Chinese communism? I think you said recently that no power in the world cared less about peace, or no government.
I think that is the present phase of it. I have no doubt that even China will get out of it. When, I can't say. Well, one can't live up to this rate or this level.
Do you think the Russians would try to restrain China during the period in which she was getting out of the growing pains?
Well, Russian influence, I suppose, will be exercised in that direction to some extent. One can't really restrain people or countries too much. But if one exercises influence, it has some effect, certainly.
Do you expect Chinese influence to increase in Asia?
Well, it's a fact that China and India are the two biggest countries of Asia. If you go back 1500 years or so, for several hundred years, China and India faced each other all over Southeast Asia. They happened to spread out more. The others were quieter people. Mm. During all that period, there was no essential conflict between India and China, although they came in contact way from Central Asia to Southeast Asia. And undoubtedly, both China and India, in their own ways, will influence other countries round about. Chinese influence will be very considerable. How far that influence takes aggressive forms is another matter.
Do you feel a sense of responsibility to the smaller Asian states that are watching this experiment in China and India?
It's good enough for me to have a sense of responsibility for my own country, for me to think of other states. If we make good in India, well, they'll be affected by it undoubtedly.
Do you feel that the basis of this influence is going to be an economic one, in both the case of China and India, as opposed to a military one? That is, he who can produce the miracle of development first may have the initiative.
Well, yes, undoubtedly. The day of military influence will grow less and less.
All over the world?
Well, all over the world. Not now, but in the course of years, because really, if you think of it, it's getting out of date, that kind of thing. With scientific developments and this tremendous weapons and all that, war as such is just unthinkable in any big way. When that's probably, there'll be disarmament, fairly considerable. It's bound to be, I think, sometime or other. That itself produces, even then, strength will be with the industrialized and scientific nations. The next 10 years is going to be a hard struggle for India, China, and other countries in Asia and Africa. A very hard struggle. First of all, to provide the necessities of life, food being the first,
yes,
and other things.
Do you think that the non-capitalist countries will outnumber the capitalist ones in time?
Capitalism today is very different from what it was even 50 years ago, much more so it was 100 years ago. It's changing very much. So, in fact, are the communist countries, at any rate, the older ones. I don't say they are giving up their basic economic policy, but they are changing. They are really approaching each other. The real difference today in the world is the well-to-do countries and the underdeveloped countries. The other difference is a temporary one. It will go when both are developed equally.
Now that the British Commonwealth contains so many completely different types of system, like Ghana and South Africa, for example, do you think it can possibly weather the next 10 years without changing its form?
And the Commonwealth has shown quite remarkable powers of adaptation and resilience. Of course, that also means that it sat tight and done nothing. Allow everybody to do what it chose. But that's a virtue, you know. It's a virtue. And preventing a deadlock by not coming near it, just allowing things to go on. But I think in the balance, it certainly is a force for, creating the atmosphere for the solution. They don't solve the problems, but it does help in creating that atmosphere. even Ghana and South Africa sit at the same table in London or wherever they might meet, which is a new development. And South Africa may not like it, but it has to
Put up with it.
put up with it. And, therefore, I do think that the Commonwealth has a good role to play, even in regard to racial relations.
The most immediate challenge to us in the West must come from Soviet Russia. Today, there are in Russia 211 million people. In 1970, there'll be 257 million. Now, we have no direct broadcast from Russia tonight, but not for want of trying. But in the studio, Edward Crankshaw, who is the Observer's expert on the Soviet Union, is discussing with Robert Key what the future holds for Russia.
How right are we in assuming that whereas it was the Russians in the form of Khrushchev and Stalin, of course, mustn't forget him, who dominated the 50s, it will be the Chinese in the form of Mao who dominates the 60s?
Oh, I think if you're going to talk in terms of decades, absolutely right. Not so much Mao as such, but the great problem of the 60s are going to be the Chinese relations with the Russians and with ourselves.
Yes, what about ourselves particularly?
Well, in a sense, we're on the same side as the Russians, speaking as white people now, because...
Goodness, do the Russians know that?
I think it's beginning to dawn on them. After all said and done, we've heard Mr. Nehru talking about these unnumbered millions of Asians and Africans, and indeed they're there. And indeed, the white peoples, of whom the Russians are a large part, are in a minority. So clearly, any problems we have over China, Mr. Khrushchev is also going to have, plus his own.
Does this mean that the Chinese are going to be an aggressive threat to us, as we once thought the Russians were?
Well, that's a guess, isn't it? I don't think so. I didn't think the Russians were ever a really aggressive threat in the sense that most of us here believed they were. I think China may be dangerous because she's so much more careless. She's got so little to lose. Russia's now got a great deal to lose.
Well, now, what about the economic battle? I mean, people are saying that, of course, in 10 years' time, the Russians will be pushing us out of world markets and that sort of thing. The Chinese going to compete with the Russians in that, too, or what?
Oh, not in this decade. I mean, enough for 10 years is enough. And I don't think the Chinese, from what one hears, are going to reach that stage.
So it's the Russians, really, who are the great economic enemies, as it were, of the 60s, would you say?
Yes, the Russians are our challenge. And they can be quite a stimulating challenge, because they're not merely addressing themselves to us in competition. They're trying to win some kind of moral leadership through economic aid over
these sort of people.
Those sort of people, uncommitted nations, and the Chinese, I should say, are going to be interested in them too. And it'll be Khrushchev's job to keep his end up as the senior communist when he really wants to relax a little and forget a little about communism and get on with economic stuff at home.
Yes, so it'll really be here, with the uncommitted nations, that the real battle between the Chinese and the Russians takes place.
I think very largely, and also, of course, between us. We've got to be sensible about the non-white part of the world very much, and be as imaginative as the Russians are being about it. And the Russians have no color bar so far, and that's a very great help.
But now, of course, we're talking as if Khrushchev's only and Mao's only interests are going to be abroad with the Africans and other Asians, the uncommitted nations. But surely, I mean, even dictators have to think mainly of life at home, don't they? And particularly dictators, perhaps.
I think Khrushchev would be only too happy to think only of life at home. That's what really interests him. He has to play as a prime minister with all this foreign stuff, and obviously he likes presenting himself as the head of a great nation abroad, but his real interests are at home.
In supplying this sort of stuff?
Oh, that kind of stuff I think he's got beyond now. After all said and done, the Russians are getting as bored with that kind of photograph as we are ourselves, and there's every sign that Mr. Khrushchev realizes.
Fine, well, let's move on if we're feeling like that about it. But you mean, really, that there's something more than just supplying trucks and television sets for the Russians, for Khrushchev, to worry Khrushchev?
It's a very, very complicated thing that he's got to do at home.
What has he got to do?
He's got, first of all, to bring Russia up to some level of prosperity far greater than was dreamed of even 10 years ago. He talks about catching up with America, but I doubt if he really thinks in terms of catching up with America, because for a Russian to catch up with America would mean to be an American. And that isn't on. They're different sort of people who want different sorts of things.
So he's got other worries, really.
Got other worries.
He looks happy enough here.
He looks very happy there, but if you think who he's got to cope with at home, he's got to cope with not the senior old guard, he's got them out of the way, but all the people who had a vested interest in Stalin, a great many, who really are interested now in making things run as they did and keeping down what even the Russians call the working classes, not quite in that tone of voice. And on the other side, he's got to get in opposition to them, he's got to get the younger ones on their side who really aren't communists at all.
What are they thinking?
In any sense. Well, they've inherited the revolution. They know nothing about it any more than our children know anything about World War I. They're sort of looking forward in one breath to the day when they can say, I'm all right, Jack. And yet, at the same time, they have a feeling that more is expected of them, and they want ideas, and they feel that Mr. Khrushchev is putting too much emphasis on milking cows and washing machines and copying America.
So you've got a sort of parallel here with what I think a lot of Americans really are probably thinking about their own society.
I think exactly like that. Only in Russia, even more toughly, because the Russians are only just beginning to think. And that's what they're going to be doing in the next 10 years, more than anything.
And they want him to think for them.
No, well, yes, they do, in a sense. They're divided people. They like to have a great big chief, and yet they get angry with their great big chief when they've got him.
So that smile may wear off his face as the 60s
No,
go
it
on.
won't, because he's a professional politician of a highly gifted kind, and no politician's ever allowed the smile to wear off his face.
Thank you very much, Mr. Crankshaw.
10 years from now, our own population will have risen from 52 million to 54.5. On the continent of Europe, which now has 420 million, there'll be in 1970 455 million. For a view of the problems that Europe will be facing in the next 10 years, we go now to France, to the economist and philosopher Bertrand de Jouvenel.
The future is unpredictable. Nobody in the first week of the 30s foresaw that this would be the decade of the Great Depression. Nor in the first week of the 50s was it predictable that Europe would end up the decade in so strong an economic position as she is. This strong economic position, obtained through American aid and our own efforts, imposes upon us new burdens of responsibility. Firstly, it does seem to me that we must assume by ourselves, in an adult manner, the burden of our defense, thus relieving our American friends. Secondly, it seems to me that we cannot leave to them what is our duty, i.e. to help the underdeveloped peoples of the world. The way to defend the Christian civilization is to behave in a Christian manner. I do hope that the 60s will see the pursuit of the high pace of economic progress which occurred in the 50s. I also hope that England shall step up her own rate by closer association with the countries which now form the continental common market. I also hope that this closer association shall combat the tendencies to be feared towards the revival of nationalism, the great and dangerous passion of our times. Next, I think that while pursuing greater efficiency, we shall be increasingly concerned in the 60s with the amenities of life, with improving the quality of life lived by our fellow citizens and by the coming generation, that we shall give more education, that we shall cultivate manners, that we shall improve that our towns, which certainly do not compare with the beautiful towns of antiquity or Renaissance Italy. I think that we shall be increasingly preoccupied with producing not only goods, but a higher and higher quality of human beings.
And so to the youngest continent, to North America. Today, it has a population of 195 million citizens. In 1970, it'll be 245 million. It's one of the greatest continents, and yet one that's least sure of its destiny. Patrick O'Donovan reports from Washington.
Almost precisely 100 years ago, America was at war with itself on a question of principle. That war between the states really decided what sort of country America was going to be. Now, in the 1960s, they are faced with less violent, but hardly less serious decisions. The American eagle, the symbol of a revolutionary democracy whose first success against the British nearly 200 years ago changed the course of history. And today it dominates a very large part of the world. Yet under its wings, all is not well. Here in America, people are well aware that the next 10 years contain an unprecedented challenge to their power, to their comfort, and perhaps even to their lives. And no other nation has ever been warned so precisely and so often. Yet life is very good here, and most people seem to feel that the next 10 years will be simply a continuation of today. But some Americans, especially the articulate ones, do not take the prospect quite so calmly. One of these is Adlai Stevenson. He's concerned with the aimlessness of ordinary life, its pointless busyness and its self-absorption. He's concerned with the lack of initiative abroad and the conformity at home. He rejects many of the things that America takes for granted. Mr. Stevenson was twice defeated for the presidency and is still standing in the wings as a democratic possible for a third try. The Panorama found him in New York on the 18th floor of his Fifth Avenue hotel.
I'm very anxious about what happens to the individual in mass society. The growth of technology has contributed to our physical ease, to our mobility, and so on, but I wonder if it's contributed to the discrimination of our minds. Certainly, we have been obsessed in this country with security, physical security, economic security, social security, and so on. The price of security is often group thinking, conformity, and all the dangers to individuality, to the diversity, to the eccentricity of individuals, which make a country exciting, interesting, and lively and dynamic. No, I think given freedom, given responsibility, that we'll discover that we're hungry for it. But the important thing is freedom. Even more important, perhaps, than the individual is national freedom and the survival of the ideas that are precious to us. I think here that that we have and see throughout the world the evolution of new societies, and I wonder if the center of gravity that we have taken for granted so long as lying either in Western Europe or the United States is going to always be that way. We've been the dominant civilization in the world for so long, I think perhaps we take it for granted. But it seems to me that new centers of power are emerging now out of the ashes of the past, in Asia, in China, in India, and so on. And that perhaps we'll have to look forward to a new grouping in Europe, a new center of power there. I think it would be a very wholesome thing, so that instead of being the dominant country in the world that we have been in the recent past, at least, I think that we will be only one of the centers of power.
But one of the characteristics of the American intellectual is to rage over his own natural imperfections and perhaps over his powerlessness in so affluent a society. They are gluttons for self-punishment. Now, in an old apartment block in New York, a citadel really of respectability, which towers over Central Park and remembers a calmer and less frenzied city, there lives one of their chief and most entertaining torturers, Maria Manis. She's a writer, a bitter poetess, and a social critic. She's gloomy over the future of American leadership during the next decade.
Well, I wish I assessed it more hopefully. I'm not at all sure, in fact, that we, the United States, are leading the West now, and I think unless we change certain states of mind and of feeling here, we won't lead. These are, as I see them, a predominantly business society in which the sale of goods transcends the sale of ideas. Sandburg, our poet, of course, said that prosperity is dripping fat, and although I know this is heresy, I think that we are reaching the point of too great prosperity, not only for our own good, but for the rest of the world. I think that we are made to buy a great many things we do not really need. I think that we should realize this and impose a voluntary discipline on our greed, which has reached really such proportions, this pursuit of things, this pursuit of money, that we no longer know what our goals are. And if we lose this intention, if we lose this purity, we cannot possibly convey it to others.
It has not always been prudent to think and talk like that in America. It's all right now, but only a few years ago, the man who was head of the Manhattan Project, the Anglo-American program which during the war produced the atom bomb, he was pilloried before Congress for his doubts. Dr. Robert Oppenheimer no longer makes bombs, and he is now their opponent. He's found his academic haven. He is head of a marvelous and richly endowed institution called the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, New Jersey. He is left alone in his institute to work and think and write and to help other people do the same. And no more is asked of him.
Well, if we look at the decade ahead and what to expect in science and of science and because of science, I suppose there's no floor to the gloom that we could allow ourselves. I think I would rather speak of what we can hope, what is reasonable to hope, and what is worth working for. One thing, surely, we'll learn more about nature than in any other 10 years of human experience. We may learn, I think the chance is good, something almost definitive about matter, the nature of matter and its order. This may be part of the present effort. We learn of the birth, life, death of stars and galaxies, and about space perhaps, which we can't travel into, but can see and hear. We learn more about the nature of life and something about ourselves. This, I think, will be the biggest explosion and have the greatest import for our views and for the quality of our life. I hope that these 10 years will see a growing effort to transform the world and the relations between states and their functions, to exorcise the unprecedented dangers of modern warfare. I hope that these 10 years, especially in the West, perhaps most especially where we need it so much, in America, in my country, that we will begin to re-knit human culture and bring the insight and the wonder of the world of nature, as science has revealed it, into relevance and meaning for the intellectual life, the spiritual life of man.
A man much concerned with the destiny of science in this country is Dr. Bronowski.
Of course, the 1960s are going to be a decade of science. But the question which interests me is, what kind of science? You see, the fallacy of the 50s has been to think that the only kind of science which matters and which is forging ahead is physical science, atomic physics, fusion, launching projectiles into space, control mechanisms, electronics. Now, I think this is a fundamental misunderstanding of the important way in which the real basis of science is shifting. I believe that the great work of the 1960s will be not in physics at all, but in biology. I think it's in exploring the fundamental nature of life and of living processes that the great progress of the next 10 years will come. We are on the threshold of a biological revolution. And to tell you the truth, the biological revolution has already begun. The most important piece of work I think that history will say was done in the 1950s was the work by Crick and Watson on the structure of the basic material of life. We now understand how life is handed on from generation to generation, in what way it unfolds itself and constantly renews itself. And that's where we shall go in the 1960s. We shall learn much more about the way that the cell works. Perhaps we shall learn what really makes a cell go wrong. And then we shall at last have the basic secret of cancer. We shall certainly learn a great deal more about the action of drugs on cells, particularly the cells of the nerves and of the brain. Well, so much for science in the laboratory. But of course, the most important future for science in the 1960s is what is going to happen outside the laboratory. Outside the laboratory, we are going to have another revolution in education. A great deal more science is going to be taught in the 1960s, in the universities, in the schools, and right down to the infant schools. Because you see, the adults of the future have got to learn that science is natural to them right in the kindergarten. The curiosity of the child has got to be transformed into that wonder at nature which is the scientist's real medium. I don't mean that we're all going to become a nation of scientists, and certainly not in the 1960s. No one wants a nation of scientists. But we need a nation in sympathy with science. And that is what I believe.
Now that may happen. But nevertheless, for most of us, the symbol of scientific progress in the 60s must remain the race to the moon. And who'll win? Perhaps by 1970, the first spaceship will have landed on the moon. We shall know whether these men are Russian or American. They can hardly be British. But even if there's no British moon rocket by 1970, we shall have a grandstand view through the aerials of our huge radio telescope at Jodrell Bank. Here's the director, Professor Lovell.
Last year, the telescope at Jodrell Bank was involved in some exciting research programs. These covered the exploration of the remote parts of the universe and the tracking of the American and Russian space probes. Personally, I think that Russia now has the capability of both of sending a man into space, at least for a few orbits around the Earth, and also of making a soft landing of instruments on the moon. I think that within a few years also we shall see instrumented probes getting close to the nearer planets, such as Mars and Venus. And of course the great question which arises is whether within this decade we shall see the actual landing of a man on the moon. Now it's very difficult to judge whether this will in fact take place. But it's useful to remember that the president of the Russian Academy, Nesmeyanov, has stated that the project of landing a man on the moon is in the next 7-year plan for Soviet science. Now, all that I can say about that is that a short time ago I wrote an article for a literary gazette in Moscow and made reference to Nesmeyanov's statement. Well, the article was published as I wrote it, apart from the fact that the time scale of the man on the moon project was crossed out. So I think that at the present time it must be regarded as somewhat doubtful whether the man will be landed on the moon within this decade. I think that these new possibilities which man has for the exploration of the solar system faces us with a very great moral responsibility. You see, one of the great questions which faces us today is whether life on Earth is unique, or whether some form of life has evolved elsewhere in the universe. Now, contemporary theories of the formation of the solar system certainly do not exclude the possibility that the primeval organisms from which life has evolved on Earth may have existed on the interplanetary dust and indeed be widespread throughout the universe. Our great hope of establishing whether this is correct is by the sampling of the planetary atmospheres by instrumented probes and, of course, by the landing of suitably skilled scientists on the moon and the planets. Now, it would be the greatest tragedy if this exploration was carried out in such a way that the atmospheres or the surfaces of the planets were contaminated with the earthly organisms and thus ruined our chances forever of making these great decisions.
And now the final challenge of the 1960s, one that is near, real and present. The thousands of victims of the upheavals of this century. The people searching for nations that will take them in. People like these that Ronald Searle saw and drew. People like these Hungarian children, victims of the revolution in Hungary but born as refugees in Austria. Two of these are lucky. They have homes ready in America. But there are others. Others like the Fessal family, who live in this old railway truck near Salzburg. And Joseph Rizavec, once a master cabinet maker, but for 12 years a crippled refugee in his wheelchair in Italy. And Paul Weishaupt, this hopeless figure, who owned a big herb business in Hungary. He sits in an Austrian camp deserted by his relatives in America. This dormitory is in an Austrian refugee camp, and the three men you see are all hardcore cases. No one wants them, and they've given up hope. And this is Anna Bart from Yugoslavia, who once paid for a loaf of bread for her dying daughter in an internment camp by giving the gold fillings of 12 of her teeth to the camp commandant who pulled them out himself. She and her husband can't work. Another part of Europe, Trieste, where refugees in transit live in this old Nazi concentration camp. The barred windows on the ground floor were those of the solitary confinement cells, and the prisoners looked across the courtyard at the gas ovens and the crematorium. The remnants of the furnace and the chimney are still there. Refugees have been living in this camp at San Saba for as long as 9 years, officially in transit. And whole families live in little hardboard cubicles. And to Greece, to Velko Markovsky, a prisoner of war or refugee for nearly the whole of his life. His home in the 1960s is likely to be among these old clothes and boots and shoes that he picks over in the camp in Athens. Athens, where thousands of refugees live miserably in these squalid shacks. And so, in these refugees, we find the past and the present and the future. This little boy was born a year ago in a refugee camp near Naples. As the decade of the 60s ends, he'll be 11. Where will he be then?